All right, you are listening to the Maker's Quest podcast. I'm Brian Benham.
And I am Greg Porter. And today we are talking about people in our life that we've come across that have helped shape us in how we work, what we do, how we approach what we do. Obviously, a lot of us are influenced from people that we may never meet in real life. But today we're talking about people that we've met in real life and have helped either shape our skills or shape the way that we approach our work. And Brian, I'm going to start off by asking you if there's somebody that you can recall that had, I'd say maybe we start from the most impression or influence on us, and then we can kind of work from there.
Work our way down. Okay, so we're going to start with the person with the most influence. I got to say my dad, of course.
Uh-huh.
Because I just spent so much time with him, and he was in the construction industry my whole life. I grew up in the construction industry. He was a project manager for a bridge building company. My whole life, and before that he was a carpenter, so he had a lot of range of skills, a lot of variety of skills. And he was also had the mindset that why would I hire somebody when I could do it myself? And so there was a lot of me holding the flashlight situations for him. There was a lot of just at a young age of building fences, fixing things on the house. Oh, the dishwasher's leaking. Okay, we're gonna pull that thing out, take it apart, put the dishwasher back together, all that kind of stuff. He helped me get my first construction job at the bridge construction company he worked for. I worked in the fabrication shop, which we talked about in another episode.
Mhm.
So there was just a lot of things that he taught me because he was such a well-rounded man of many talents. I guess the jack of all trades, maybe expert at none and an expert at a few things. But yeah, so that's kind of how I grew up. It was just like, oh, it broke, we'll just fix it. Oh, we need this thing, we're gonna make it. So that's how that kind of went about. And then from a business standpoint, he taught me a lot about how to not necessarily run a business, but to think like a business person.
Uh-huh.
So like when I was 13, I had a paper route for a number of years. And my first year, I was just delivering papers like normal. And he's like, hey, why don't you ask your customers if there's a particular place they want their um, paper put. Like one guy had his morning coffee on his back porch, and so that customer said, "Yeah, just walk around the gate and throw it on my back porch for me." And so I started doing that, and by my second year, instead of getting like a $5 or $10 tip for Christmas or whatever, I was getting like 50 and $100 tips from customers for Christmas. So just like that Christmas thing was several $1,000s just in tips compared to the year before, just by adding that one little extra thing to do for the customer and not expecting anything for it, just better customer service for the customer. So yeah, I'd say my dad shaped me in a lot of ways, taught me a lot of skills in the workshop and in business.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, now of course I feel guilty if I don't say my dad uh when I'm thinking of people, but my dad did have a big influence on me. He was an electrician and did all kinds of other things. Similarly, um, we fixed a lot of things at home, but there were things he didn't know about, and woodworking was one of those things. And metalworking, I think, frightened him to the point where he thought it was, potentially going to kill me. So he didn't want anything to do with it.
Yeah.
But I would kind of skip my dad and say, yes, my dad taught me a lot of things, and he taught me a lot of craftsmanship. I think that was probably my number one, taking pride in your work. Because of the way he bent conduit and hung it on the wall, and you could step back and say a craftsman did that. But I would skip over to my wife's grandfather, Cecil, who passed away just a couple of years ago. Um, was an insane influence on me in that he was one of the first people I ran into that started sharing the thought that it doesn't matter what it is, you can do it. And um, he he was one of those guys that just would get these weird ideas and just make it happen. Like, even if he didn't know how to make it happen, he would figure out a way to make it happen. He was a machinist, he was a welder, he was a mechanic, he was a lot of things, but then he worked well outside of those areas too. And one of the examples he shared with me is, telescoping forks on a motorcycle haven't always been around. And when his kids started riding motorcycles, which they were really young, my gosh, like, uh, single digit years when they started riding dirt bikes and motorcycles, he fabricated a set of telescoping forks for them to make the ride more smooth, so to speak. And telescoping forks weren't a thing that you could just go out and buy at that time. He
Mhm.
just said, I'll bet if I did this, it would make the ride easier. It'd be more like a shock on a car. So I'm going to do that. And so he machined a set of telescoping forks for one of his kids' little motorcycles, and away they went. I think they were on the Today Show at one point. That was, the level of kind of genius and crazy man that he was, showing off what his kids were doing, because they used to perform at county fairs and things like that. So he was a motorcycle racer, raced all over the country at the big tracks, ran at Daytona, things like that. Had some really cool stories about motorcycle racing, and then was just, their family would just take off when they were on summer break. They would leave for 2 months at a time with no map, nowhere to go. Just, we want to get out of here. And when they had to come back for school, well, I guess we better start making our way back across the country. So, but he taught me, like, you can make anything. Just take your time and think about it. Think about what you want to do, and then you know formulate a plan to make it happen. And if you don't have the skills, reach out to somebody who does, and they'll probably show you, because if you show interest in something and you're a young person, people are very apt to drop what they're doing and show you, because you're taking an interest, right? And so he taught me a lot about machining and welding and making mechanized things. We pulled transmissions apart and rebuilt them, rebuilt motors together. Uh, like, you name it, we did it. We built his house. My goodness, from, just, he had a Cape Cod and he wanted it to be 3 times the size. And so we started forming concrete and pouring stem walls and framing floors. And before you knew it, there was a house there. And there was a big group of the family that would go out there every single weekend and do stuff. And that's where I learned how to plumb things, how to, do stuff that was outside of my wheelhouse. So he was a huge influence. His work wasn't always the prettiest work, but if it needed to be pretty, it was. You know what I mean? Like, he would
Mhm.
get by on some things, but when it needed to look really sharp, he made it look really sharp. And he ended his career as a machinist for TWA, working on rotating parts inside of Rolls-Royce engines. So, like, he had the ability to really dial it in when he needed to dial it in. I think I've told that story before, but he was one of no, he was the only person, I think, in the world authorized to work on bearings that Rolls-Royce made in a repair that he had developed and the FAA approved and all that fun stuff. So, like, some really big accomplishments over his life, but he just taught me that it doesn't matter what it is, just break it down, figure out the pieces, and get to work. If you make a scrap part, throw it away and start over again.
Yeah. So before he worked as a machinist, uh, uh, was did he do other construction type stuff, or was he always a machinist?
He started pretty early on as a machinist. He was a setup guy for Alice Chalmers, which, those who don't know who Alice Chalmers is, they make tractors. I don't know if they're still in business, but a lot of the orange tractors, I think Alice Chalmers is orange. John Deere's green, Alice Chalmers orange.
Mhm.
International Harvester, I think, is red. Those are the big three, I think. But he was a setup guy in their factory. So if they were making, stators for starters or alternators or whatever, he would go and set up the lathe so that you could put a raw stock part in it and start making the piece. So if there were stops that needed to be set up, he would set those up, and he would get everything worked in a very precision manner so that someone could come in and make production parts. And then, pardon me, at some point They would be done making that part, and he would go in and set up the next operation to make the next part. So they would give him the drawings and specs on the parts, and he would set up the machines so that they could fabricate them by the thousands. And I always thought that was a fascinating job. Like he was the one guy that had to go in there and be extraordinarily technical so everybody else could be extraordinarily lazy. And I don't mean lazy that they show up to work and be lazy, but they didn't have to think about anything, right?
It was
Mentally
it was
lazy.
ready to go.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was the start of his career. But like I said, he grew up on a farm. And so if the bean conveyor broke, they had to fix the bean conveyor. And if they didn't have parts to fix the bean conveyor, they had to make the parts to fix the bean conveyor because he lived out in the middle of nowhere. So either that or you pick up a shovel and you start shoveling because the conveyors broke. Uh, so yeah, that was where he started life.
Yeah. Uh,
So sorry, I feel like I should throw it back to you,
okay.
Brian. So
Yeah.
so your dad started off bridge building construction. Then where does it go from there?
So uh, from there, I would say I was my neighbor Mark. And Mark was an interesting guy. When I think when I was very young, he rode with like a little motorcycle gang. So not anything nefarious like Hell's Angels or anything like
Right,
that.
right, right.
But he rode around in a Harley Davidson motorcycle, and he was always working on his motorcycle in his driveway, wrenching on things. And he was like this interesting, burly dude. And at first, I wasn't sure if my mom really liked him because my mom's very strict Baptist lady, and he's like this burly biker guy. But they've lived next to each other for 50 years now, and they're like the best of friends. So it all worked out great. But when I was like 6 or 7 years old, just during the summer, there's nothing for a 6 or 7 year old kid to do, and my mom would be like, "Go outside and play." So I just go next door to hang out with Mark because he worked from home, and what he did was he was like a dental technician's for making false teeth and gold crowns and things like that. And he had built a shop in the back of his house or in his backyard. So half the shop had a big wall down the middle that divided it in half. So half the shop was a wood shop, and the other half was where he made his dental crowns. So when you go to the dentist, if you lived in Eugene, Oregon, and the dentist took an impression of your teeth and said, "All right, we're going to send this off to our lab to have your crown made," there's a good chance it went to my neighbor's backyard. So,
Uh-huh.
so yeah, so I'd go over there and I'd hang out with him and watch him make gold crowns. So to this day, I'm pretty sure I could fumble my way through making a gold crown because I watched him make enough of them, from taking the impression to making a wax casting of the negative of the impression, and then melting the wax out to put the gold in, and the whole process to do it. And yeah, he was just like this interesting dude. I'd go over there, we'd watch him make gold crowns, and while he's making gold crowns, he was always watching Judge Wapner on TV. So for the younger audience, Judge Wapner was the predecessor to Judge Judy. I guess Judge
Yeah.
Judy's the new judge. We watched a lot of Jerry Springer. My mom would probably hate that. Knowing that this 6 year old kid's over there watching Jerry Springer, and who's the guy that got the broken nose? Geraldo
Oh,
Rivera.
yeah.
Yeah, Geraldo Rivera. So watch TV over there and watch make gold crowns. And then when he wasn't making gold crowns, he made clocks and other woodworking stuff in the woodworking side of his shop. And that he actually made my wife and I a clock when we got married that hangs in our living room. So I got to learn a bunch of cool woodworking stuff from him. And hold on, I'm going to grab something here. I was going to grab this before, but I forgot. So when I was probably 6 or 7 years old, I went to summer camp, and one of the things you do at summer camp is um, like they have arts and crafts.
Yeah.
So one of the arts and crafts, they gave us a piece of mirror that was covered in tape, a razor blade, and some etching acid. And so like is I know this is Gen X, so I don't know if you'd be
Yeah.
able to do that. today, given a 6 or 7 year old razor blades and stuff. So I carved my name out of that glass or out of
Nice.
the tape and etched my name with the etching stuff. And then when I got back from camp, I went next door and asked Mark if he would help me make a frame. And so this is the earliest thing I can remember making that I still have is this little wooden frame that we made in his shop.
Oh, that's
So
awesome.
yeah, and he's still making stuff today. He's pretty much legally blind. Um, but he has like these super spectacle things so he can still see what he's doing up close. And he made a guitar that's actually a cane. So the uh the shaft of the cane is the little fretboard, and then the bottom and the foot is where you play the guitar. And that was the
Uh,
latest thing that he made when I was there this last summer visiting
oh,
that I
wow.
saw.
Wow. That's a cool guy to have as a neighbor.
Yeah, so learned all kinds of things. He was kind of one of the guys that I realized that if you know how to do something, you don't have to have a big manufacturing whatever make it for you. You can just go make it yourself because he's making teeth in his backyard.
Wow. That's awesome. Uh, I've had some interesting neighbors over the years, but I've never had anybody who made gold teeth in their backyard. I think that'd
Yeah,
be a
gold
cool guy
crowns.
to
Yeah.
have.
Yeah, he probably retired on all the little pieces he saved because he had a little cup that anytime he had to scrape off or cut off, he'd save that little chunk of gold and stick it in a cup.
The the unburied treasure, as it were.
Yeah.
Well, kind of thinking along the lines of I, I started to look at like this list of people that I wrote down, and I saw one unique unique feature I feel like that everybody has, and that feature is that all these people colored out the line outside of the lines, so to speak. And my grandfather Mel was one of those people. He had dreams in life, and some of those things he accomplished, some of them he didn't. He was a worker at a gyp mill, and out in the middle of nowhere in Iowa. And I've probably told stories about him before, but he didn't have a ton of money. He bought some acreage out in the middle of nowhere, but he bought it intentionally on the riverbank so that he could feed his family without having to worry about money, right? Like you were always going to be fed. We didn't have to worry about that because he could always catch fish. And he did. He fed the family by fishing quite often. But he served in World War II and got back from the war and wanted to build a house. And so he bought that property and said, I'm going to build a house. And he knew nothing about building houses. And he bought the Time Life series of books. And I'm sure a lot of people of my vintage had those books on the shelf from their parents or their parents' parents. And that was one of the things I inherited from him when he passed away was his Time Life books, and they inspired me as well. But what what he did, he learned to build houses. He understood how to cut rafters and do all those things just because he read those books and how to frame houses. But what that eventually wound up doing for him is it just opened up the door. Like anything he wanted to make, he figured out how to do it. So him and my dad actually built the, I think, the top floor of their house. They built the foundation and lived in the foundation for I think 3 years while he saved up money to buy the materials to build the top of the house. So if you can imagine, my mom and her sister and her dad and her mom all lived in the basement there for a couple of years in Iowa, where winters can be pretty damn harsh. I
Yeah.
always just kind of wonder what that looked like. No way in telling now. Everybody who has that memory is long gone. But my grandfather, when I was growing up, every year he had a project that he did for the grandkids. So one year he made, I'll call them Japanese box kites, but I don't know if that's the right origin. But it's a box kite, which when you see them, you think there's no way this thing can fly. It's too big. How do you get this up in the air without just crashing it? There's no way it's just going to take off. And He made my brother and I and my cousins. I had two cousins that he made us box kites one year, and it was a pretty interesting design. It involved sewing, it involved putting together the balsa wood or basswood frame, and then all the little things. I think he used what do you call them? It's a fishing line, a swivel. There it is, a fishing
Mhm.
swivel. It's where you attach your rope and all that kind of stuff. But I can remember being out on the farm with him one day, and I was always into weird things as a kid, or wanting to do weird things as a kid. Still, I mentioned to him one day that I wanted a set of stilts, and he just dropped what he was doing. He said, "Let's go make a set of stilts." I was like, "Well, I didn't think you were actually going to do this, but yeah, this would be
Let's
awesome."
do it. Yeah.
And we went in the shop, and he had some, scrap 2x2 that we used for the legs. And then let's cut a 2x4, the place for your foot to go on. And I've got some Romex. Let's, tack that on as a stirrup, to lock your foot in. And next thing I knew, it was 30 minutes later, I had a pair of stilts, and me and my cousins were walking around in the yard on them, trying to figure out how to do it without falling over. And, that was definitely a switch that flipped in my head, that you can have an idea and you can act on that idea right now. And another day I would mention weird things to him. I mentioned that I really wanted to ski. He's like, okay, yeah, let's figure it out. And like, what? You think we can really ski? And he took some T-post, I think is what it was. He took some T-post and like bent the front edge of it up with a conduit bender or something. I can't remember how he did it. And came up with some way to strap them to my feet. And of course they didn't work for shit in the snow. But it was, they looked like skis, they strapped to your feet. They did all the things they needed to do. They just didn't work. But just the fact that it would go from me as a 3 or 4 year old having some weird idea. I'm saying that's how old I was. Maybe I was a little older than that, but I think that was about the age. To having some weird idea and then going in the shop, seeing all the tools sitting there and going, I could use those tools to make this thing that I just had in my head. And that was a huge impression on me as a young man, that when I found out, when my dad told me, hey, grandpa and I built this house, like it wasn't here. When you're a little kid, you don't understand how houses get there. And it's like every board we put together, put the shingles on the roof, we did, put the windows in, we painted it, we did all the things. And it was at that point things started to click in my head at a really young age, that you can do all of this stuff, you can figure it out. And I think invaluable. So all you guys out there who have kids and grandkids, it's a huge thing to make that impression early on a young man or a young woman. So
Yeah.
there's my two grandfather stories.
All
Let's
right.
flip
Yeah.
back to you. I know there's more
Well,
people.
I want to point out one thing about your story and your
Sure.
ski failures is that's one thing that I had to teach myself with my kids, is that it's okay to allow them to fail, right?
Yeah.
Like the time spent together is more valuable than the actual project. Like me, when they would come out into the shop and they would want me to help them make something, right, I was the had the mindset at first like, oh, I got to help them make this perfect thing because that's what I do for a living. And sometimes it's kind of like frustrating, like, oh no, just you cut it more like this, and or whatever the thing was. And then I realized one day, like, wait a minute, what am I doing? Like they just want to hang out, right? And just make stuff. It doesn't matter if it works or doesn't work. If it works, cool, awesome. We'll even have a better time, but we're gonna have a good time just trying to make stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, before we move on, I'm going to give the flip side of that. You said it's important to let them know that failure is okay, and it is important to allow them to fail, like give them the space to fail. And the example I want to share, I had a neighbor 2 doors down from me, and he had a son that he was divorced from his wife. And so his son would come and spend the summers with him. His son lived in California. This guy lived in Kansas City, and he would come and spend the summers. And so I would hang out. His name was Mike. I'd hang out with Mike all summer. And his dad would always, hey, let's come up with a project let's do a project together, guys. This would be fun. And so we would sit and dream up things, and I would scribble out little drawings of things. We were both into skateboarding, and we desperately wanted to build a skateboard ramp. And we spent 2 summers trying to convince this guy's dad that we could build a skateboard ramp. And he just kept asking for more proof and more things. And you haven't really thought this out. And we never built the skateboard ramp ever. And I remember being so frustrated with, why won't he just let us try? And
Yeah.
he wouldn't even let us try. We wouldn't even let us try. The whole thing was, he had resided his house and he had a sheet of plywood, one sheet of plywood left over, and we were going to make the skateboard ramp out of that sheet of plywood. And he wouldn't let us cut into it until he approved our plan, and we never got there. So that sheet of plywood sat in the garage against the wall and never got used. And
Yeah.
there were 2 young men that, even if it would have been a massive failure, we would have learned a ton from that failure.
Yeah, to try to expect kids to have a master plan. Like so many times when I build stuff, I don't even have a master plan. I'm just gonna like go out there and like start putting it together. Like, all right, I know the ramp needs to be at a certain angle. So, all right, now what am I gonna prop it up with? What do we have laying around? Like just that problem solving and thought process is invaluable. And yeah.
Yeah, I
So
mean, gosh, I go back to, I'm gonna lament over this one for just 10 more seconds.
okay.
I mean, I go back to, I think we could have leaned it against a tree and like put a couple nails in it,
Yeah.
and that would have been enough to learn something from. Oh, it's too steep, or it's bending too much when we get on it, or whatever it is. We couldn't even get there. We couldn't even pull the sheet of plywood out of the garage. We couldn't even get that far to do anything. He wouldn't
Yeah.
let us. Anyway,
Yeah.
I digress. You can tell that one hurts.
That
That one
one's yeah,
hurts deep.
that's yeah, we might need to hunt that guy down and have a conversation with him now. We'd probably go to jail for picking on an old man, but
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, one last thing on failure. Like Adam Savage famously said on Mythbusters, failure is not an option, but I always think like may not be an option, but it should be a requirement.
I agree. And I mean, the path to success is failure. There's
Yeah.
no way to succeed without failing. Now, if you give up because you failed, that's the issue.
That's the
Like,
real failure right there.
yeah, failure should not be an end point. Failure should be a milestone, and you should have many milestones. You should fail many times. If you're making something better, it means that you didn't make it right the first time. And when you look at how, you know, well things are refined, and you can pick up anything around you, the Sharpie pen. How many iterations of the Sharpie pen do you think they came out with before they got this really nice smooth thing where the cap just clicks on and off, right? I guarantee there's a box of 1,000 Sharpie pens that are the wrong shape and size
Hmm.
before they got to this one. And so yeah, you absolutely have to fail. And then the question is, at what point is your failure acceptable, right? Like, everybody who's ever made something, I know we're going way off on a distant thing, but these are important stuff. Anybody who's ever made anything, the first thing they do is start showing you where it didn't meet expectations. Oh yeah, there's this dent over here. There's this piece that I couldn't get sanded out, or this piece of trim doesn't exactly line up with this other piece of trim. Those are
Hmm.
failures, but they're acceptable failures, right?
Yeah.
Maybe not to that person, but to everybody else, they're acceptable. And so understanding that even when you're done with something, there are still pieces that you failed at, that you didn't hit the mark you wanted to, but it's
Yeah.
still acceptable.
There's always another level of perfection, and that's you kind of said it right there, like what's acceptable for you and what other people will accept. So there's a lot of things that as I build stuff, I always try to make it as perfect as I can, but there's always that little thing that's not as perfect and I wish I could make it again, but I'm out of budget, out of time. And so now when I screw something up, I'll just leave it or I'll try to fix it, and then if I like the fix, great. If not, I'm going to remake it. But the really true test of whether I'm going to go back through the effort to remake that part is if I'm laying in bed at night worrying about whether the client is going to accept it.
Yeah.
If I go to sleep and not worrying about whether the client's going to accept it, that I forgot about it by the time I go to bed, I'm the next day I'm moving on. But if I'm laying awake at night worrying if the client's going to accept that mistake or not, then I'm going to go make the remake the part.
Well, so kind of back to our topic, your next person on your list.
Yeah. So the next person on my list is James Phillips. James Phillips was my saxophone teacher in high school. This tenor right here is actually his saxophone. Um, I purchased it from him back in the day. And he was a really amazing saxophone player, a really amazing teacher. You may have heard of the band Cherry Poppin' Daddies. In the late 2000s, they had a top 40s hit called Zoot Suit Riot.
Yep.
So yeah, I was pretty proud to know him and watch that band become successful. He was one of the founding members. That those members came out of the University of Oregon music department, or most of them. So that's kind of how he was going there to get his teaching degree in music education. So that's how I came to study with him. And one of the things that he taught me, well, a couple of things is one, not to take everything so seriously. Like life's too short. Like don't be so serious about it. But the most important thing he taught me is to learn from other people, no matter what. Every person has something to teach you. And he would always use the example of like jazz musicians when they get together to do improv, they play off of each other's ideas, and that's how the improvisation song develops, is playing off each other's ideas, and you can learn from each other's ideas. And uh, he he had a list of all the musicians that he wanted uh, to jam with and work with, so he could play off their ideas. And some of these were like master musicians back then, like Dizzy Gillespie, but he hadn't died yet. But he died, I think, my freshman year in high school or sophomore year in high school, somewhere around there. But Dizzy Gillespie was on the list, and his goal was not only to learn from the master, but also hopefully that the master would play off of his ideas and the master would learn from him. And so that was kind of the impetus of his talk, was that even if you even if you think that you can't learn something from someone else because you're more advanced or further down the journey than they are, they can still teach you something, whether that's teach you how to be a better teacher or whatever. They can teach you that each person that you meet has something to offer. You just may not realize it yet.
I have to agree wholeheartedly. I mean, like everybody you meet has something to teach you.
Yeah.
And they may not actively teach it to you, but if you observe, you'll figure out what they're teaching you. Goes back to the whole mentorship thing, right? I'm at the age in my life where they call me the mentor and not the mentee in a lot of situations. And whenever I'm quote unquote mentoring somebody, I'm learning more from them than they're learning from me. I guarantee it.
Right. And even like the most nastiest, evilest person can teach you something. They can teach you resolve and teach you how to control your emotions and not react to
Yeah.
their negativity and be pulled in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I always say there's a lot of things that I learn from people that what's not to do.
You're right.
And sometimes that's just as important. It's like, I do not want to be like that guy ever.
Yeah.
That was a terrible experience for me for one reason or another. And so I learned, this is not how I'm either going to treat people or act around other people when I'm in this situation. And yeah. Well,
Yeah. So just to lighten the mood, James did
yeah.
pass away a few years ago from cancer, but one of my favorite stories of hanging out with him is I was working construction, so I had access to pickup trucks and things.
Uh-huh.
Um, and he wanted to move a piano. He traded somebody something for this piano, and he's like, "Hey, can you help me move this piano with your truck?" And I was like, "Sure." So we go to this dude's house, and we somehow managed to get this upright piano in the back of my truck after a lot of grunting or whatever. And he was worried about the truck was gonna or the piano was going to tip over or roll around as we were driving. So his plan was to sit back in the back of the truck with the piano.
Oh
And
boy.
so we're driving across town through through downtown traffic, and he's sitting on the edge of the pickup truck playing the piano and singing as we were driving along through town, like we were like a one car parade going through town.
There's probably people who still talk about seeing that.
Yeah, look at these two
This
nutsos driving down
crazy
the
guy in the back of a pickup playing the
pickup truck.
piano.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, along the musical lines of things, I know I've talked about this guy before, but I'll talk about it in a little more detail. Is Mr. Canetto lived down the street from me, and he worked on guitars and scratch built guitars in his garage, and that was another huge eye opener for me. I want to say it was sixth grade. That's my recollection. Was it was in sixth grade, because that's when I really started getting into music in that way, guitar and rock and roll kind of stuff. And my buddy mowed his lawn. You know how little kids mow lawns in their neighborhood. And at band practice one week, he said, "I mow this guy's lawn and he makes guitars." And I'm like, "No, that's not possible. Like, you can't just make a guitar." You know,
Yeah.
you don't know how they're made, but you just know that you not a normal person could just make one, right? "No, I'll show you. I'll show you." And he drugged me down the street to this guy's house, knock on the door. He said he doesn't believe that you're making guitars. It was that kind of thing. And he's like, "Well, let me show you." And he opened up his garage and showed the guitars that he was making, and I can remember it wound up as a burgundy Telecaster. It was a really pretty guitar. But just started with blocks of wood, and they became the neck and the body of the guitar. And he he was one of those people, like, there was nobody asking him or telling him that he should share what he was doing with these young men, right? That they're knocking on his door, that are interested in rock and roll. But he knew somehow that he needed to do that. Like, if these kids are interested, you need to take the time to share this with them, because it may change their lives. And it changed mine for sure. That's why I have a company that makes guitar tools, because I learned how to repair guitars from him and what it took. And I watched him make his own tools to build and set up guitars. And that makes a huge impression on somebody when you're like, I can still remember, this just happens to be out. This is a string winder, right? So you put this on your tuning peg and you wind it around like this, and it keeps you from having to twist your wrist 1,000 times when you're changing strings on a guitar. And me and my buddy were down there, and he was working on my friend's guitar. I can't remember. He was swapping pickups in and out of it or doing something, but had to change a couple strings. And he started changing this string, and he goes, "Where's my string winder?" He couldn't find it. And he goes, "Well, I'm tell you what, I am not going to sit here and wind this string by hand." He just went out in the garage, picked up a couple pieces of wood out of the scrap bin, and, on the bandsaw, cut out this profile here that looks like a weird L shape or whatever. And then on his drill press, drilled out the little hole here, or the pocket there. And then he had a piece of round dowel stock, drilled a hole in it, and made it do this. And 15 minutes later, he had a string winder in his hand that didn't exist. And it was at that moment that I realized, like, if I have these tools and I develop these skills, I can do the same thing when I need a fill in the blank. I can go out and use those tools to make that thing. And not only that, he walked us through, over the course of a summer. He, started from a block of wood and made a Telecaster. And he actually, I take that back. The first guitar he made that I saw was a Stratocaster. The second one was a Telecaster, because my buddy's guitar was the brand was a Lotus, but it was a Telecaster shape. And he asked to trace his guitar. He goes, "Can I trace your guitar?" "Yeah, sure." And then we came back segmentally over the summer and watched him go from block of wood to Telecaster. And he showed us all the steps that he was doing. And that was where I learned, not not the exact science of building a guitar, but that's where I learned the sequence of things. Like, this has to be done first, that has to be second, this has to be third. And then you wind up with a guitar that you can play. And to this day, I'm still building guitars. I have a company that makes tools for guitars on a, totally different scale than Vince Canetto was doing in his garage. But had he not taken the time to show me, and my friend Jay was his name, if he hadn't taken time to show JJ and I what he was doing in his garage and the tools he was using, I guarantee I wouldn't be doing this stuff today.
Yeah, it's
So
amazing how environment makes an impression on your trajectory of life.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I look at the architecture side of my world too, right? For those who don't know, I work full time as an architect. And again, seeing the house that my grandfather and my dad built, and seeing, my dad taking me on commercial job sites when I was in grade school still, so that I could see a building coming together. I mean, that is hugely influential. And when you're thinking about entering a profession where you're designing every component that goes into a building, like, you have to see those things at a fairly young age to understand them at that level. But uh, so yeah, there's number 3 on my list, Mr. Canetto. I'm guessing you probably have more on your list,
Well,
Brian.
I have two more kind of things,
Yeah,
but I kind of want to derail us for a second.
sure, do it.
Um, you're like, yes, derail. So Telecaster, Stratocaster, I've heard those names before. I thought they were
Yeah.
companies, but listening to you talk about them, I'm sorry, I'm kind of ignorant in the guitar world. Are styles of guitars then?
They are, and we're gonna pan the camera around.
Okay.
So, and I could just go pick them off the wall. This white one is a Fender Stratocaster,
Okay.
and the yellow one down here is a Fender Telecaster. So they're both Fender guitars. The Telecaster is what they call a slab body. So there's really not much detail. It's just you cut the shape out of it and it's that, right? It's just a
Okay.
big chunk of wood. You ease the edges on it and you attach a neck. Simplest guitar to make. The Stratocaster has some carve to it. So there's some beveling and some other things. So and then the Les Paul, which is this one here, is a Gibson. It's not a Fender, but the Gibson is a carved top guitar, and is not, the neck has a break angle to the headstock, where the Fenders are a flat slab, very simple to make. So yes, Stratocaster and Telecaster are of the same make, different models.
Different models. Okay. But
Yes,
they're a Fender model,
Fender brand.
brand
Uh,
model. So you couldn't go get a Les Paul Telecaster.
no, so sorry, Gibson this is not a Fender make.
Okay.
This is a Gibson make Les Paul model. Um, Totally different. But that's the evolution of the guitars manufacturing. Is
Okay.
most people who start out building a guitar start with a Telecaster because they're very simple, and then they move to the Stratocaster because it's a little bit more difficult, and then a lot of people never get to making a Gibson Les Paul style because it's a tenon style glued in neck with a break angle on the headstock, and it requires some pretty high level skill, in carving a top and doing all the things. So yeah, um, and then it goes further. There's a PRS back here, which is another carved top taken from the Gibson world, but they go even further into the carving, is a little bit more exotic, if you will.
Yeah. And then you shared a gentleman, I think Godfrey Guitars with me.
Yeah, Les
That is
Gottfried.
even more,
Yeah, so he
yeah,
does scroll work.
scroll,
His
yeah.
work is probably um more inspired by violin making, and then the what's it, Lloyd, oh, there's a mandolin maker, I'm just losing, Lloyd Lohr. is his name, and he did the same type of intricate scroll work on
Scrolls, yeah.
mandolins, and his mandolins are among the best. You know, you ask anybody um, in the mandolin world who's the man, and it's Lloyd Lohr. Um, you know, and he's the Stradivarius, I suppose, of the mandolin world. So yeah, Les does a lot of those violin carve, right? So he does the C carves. He makes bass guitars for those who don't know. Um, Les Godfrey, if you want to look him up, he's made bass guitars for Les Claypool. He worked, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he worked for a very famous bass guitar maker that's made guitars for all the big names out there. And Les has kind of gone on to carry that torch and do similar things. But while he worked under that gentleman, he made bass guitars for a lot of really well-known famous people. And now he makes guitars and bass guitars, and they're some of the most creative, insane, cool, well-built bass guitar. I think there's a difference, right? There's a lot of people out there. um, Kiss comes to mind. They had these guitars that kind of look like skulls and whatever else. They were, if you ever see them up close, they're kind of terrible guitars, right? They were just hacked together. They just
Mhm.
were made to look cool. And there are guys like Les out there who not only make cool looking guitars, but they are fantastic instruments. And he combines those two together. So he's absolutely one of the top level master craftsmen in the luthier world when it comes to bass guitars, for sure. But then also on the 6 string guitar end of thing, he does some amazing work. His design work, I feel like, is so unique. There's people who copy him, but
Yeah. Yeah, he
uh,
gets a little unhinged
he
on his
does.
Instagram about that, but he's definitely worth a follow. He's
Yeah,
very interesting dude and very talented.
very talented. And I keep thinking at some point in my life, I'm going to save up and buy a guitar from Les, and I probably will at some point. I just haven't yet.
Yeah.
Um, they're I'm not going to say a little above my pay grade. I could absolutely afford to buy one. It's just not been a priority for me, but I do want to buy. I'd love to have one of his Dragonetti style
Yeah.
guitars. They're just fantastic. So, yeah. Well, yeah. So there we go. We changed topics, but now getting back on
Yeah.
track.
Well, I think the rabbit hole topics is kind of what keeps
Oh yeah,
the pod interesting. You know, it's not so, you know, because those are just off the cuff. But
yeah.
yeah, so back to our topic. So it kind of in the same vein as James Phillips tried to learn things from everybody. I don't have a specific person, but a group of people, and that is like all the craftsmen I've worked with over the years since I started when I was 13, or even with my neighbor Mark, 6, and my dad from birth, all the way up to today. When I go on job sites, I meet new craftsmen all the time, and they're always willing to share and teach if you're come to the table willing to learn and also share and teach, which you know too. I've been on job sites where some people kind of butt their heads together because the egos get in the way, but if you set your ego aside, um, you will always learn something from another craftsman on the job site.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. And just being the fly on the wall, peeking over somebody's shoulder and watching them work
Yeah.
sometimes is worth its weight in gold.
Yeah, absolutely. You're going to get all kinds of ideas or see something you've never seen before.
What's so back to Andrea's grandfather Cecil. He told me one day, he goes, if you want to know the easiest way to do something, find the laziest guy in the shop and watch him work.
Yeah, because he's got it figured out. He's got the quickest, easiest way to do it.
Yes. And Cecil was well known, again, back to his roots as a setup guy, right? When he was working for TWA, his job was to make new parts out of scrap parts. So they have a part that used to be a crankshaft for a something. I don't know. I'm making stuff up, but it used to be some kind of a shaft for a something. Well, it's been cut enough times that it's now too far undersized that you can't use it for that anymore. but it's good material. So what can we make out of it? Well, this other print over here is smaller in diameter and is shorter in length. So if you could turn that part out of this part, uh, let's do it. And you're at an airline, so they have several hundred, if not several thousand airplanes that are identical, and they all have to get overhauled. And so when they overhaul them, the stack of bad parts just piles up in the corner. So when you're making good parts out of bad parts, you have maybe 50 or 100 bad parts that are all identical. So once you figure out how to make the new part out of the old part, he would do the same thing. He would set it up so that that old part that's no longer good becomes his rough stock. And so he would set up the lathe or the grinder or whatever he was doing to run the same part out of the same stock over and over and over again. And he would set up all the automated stops and feeds and everything else. And he would sit and do crossword puzzles all day. And when and when the machines would hit the stop, he'd have a stick and he'd reach over and hit the reversing lever every 3.5 minutes or whatever it was in the middle of his crossword puzzles. So
Ah, that
Cecil was
pesky work
definitely.
getting in the way of the crossword puzzles.
Oh yeah. So and he would get in trouble all the time and his response was always, "Well, I'm making parts 2 to 1 to the guy next to me. So just tell me when you want me to go home."
Yeah. I wonder if in today's even more regulated airline industry, how many parts they're able to remanufacture.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the airline industry is a lot of those jet engines are the same as they've ever been, right? It's still the same Pratt and Whitney or Rolls Royce or fill in the blank. General Dynamics, I think, is another one who makes jet engines. Um, they don't change much because once you get one that's stable, that works really well, you kind of stick with it
Yeah.
and you just use that as a power plant. It's sort of like the Chevy 350, was for a long time. It's just kind of a standard a standard thing that is a well-known quantity that it's going to last you 150,000 miles before you're going to have to tear it apart or whatever the distance is. And so um yeah, the procedures that I mean, the manuals for those things are insane, right? The
Hmm.
remanufacturing manual. So you overhaul those engines. So every so many flight hours, right? It doesn't matter if the engine's good, bad, or indifferent. Every so many flight hours, they have to tear the engine completely down and rebuild it, right? Does it meet spec? Does it not meet spec? If it doesn't meet spec, can we grind it undersized, use a bigger bearing? Whatever that is, or they would do. They had some kind of a metal depositing that they would do. So if a part was undersized, they could either send it off to the chrome plate department, or they could send it. There was some kind of, he called it a spray carbon or something like that, where it was some kind of a spray welding type of operation, and it would deposit material on there, and then they would machine that material back down. Um, whether that was bearing journals or whatever. I don't think they ever did it to like cam lobes or things of that nature, but they would do it to bearing journals all the time. So it was amazing to me when he would describe the processes they would use to bring parts back from the dead, all
Yeah.
the different ways that they did it, and all the different tolerances that they could overcome by different different methods like that.
Yeah, because new parts are are just insanely expensive. So always good to repurpose those. So to continue this side tangent, several years ago, I had a client that had a compressor from a Boeing 727, and we suspended it in the middle of his coffee table. And he told me that after a certain number of hours or whatever, they're not allowed to do anything with it. That part has to be destroyed so it doesn't
Yep.
end up on the black market. And that's how he ended up with that engine. It was decommissioned in a way that if it ever is stolen from his house and ends up on the black market, it will not go back into a plane because we cut some shit off.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that whole industry is interesting. I mean, airframes are the same way, right? Like they have to. I don't know exactly what they do and how they do it, but the airframes have to get inspected every so many flight hours. So they have to basically rip the entire interior out of the airplane and inspect the airframe for corrosion damage, cracking, anything like that. But that's how they keep people safe, I guess,
Yeah.
which is good. I'll co-sign on that. If that makes my airline ticket $20 more expensive to fly, I'm okay with that.
Okay with that. Yeah. He
I
also
would
told
rather
me
survive.
that it shouldn't fly on airlines that are piloted out of underdeveloped countries because the black market is huge in those areas. You're
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
taking some risks. But all right, so back on our topic. So
Yeah.
you have anybody else?
Yeah. I know I've mentioned Dan Rockhill on this show before. He was one of my on this show, on this podcast before. He was one of my professors at KU in architecture. And Dan, not only being an architect, but was also a builder. So he would fabricate. Um, he designed a lot of houses. He's designed commercial buildings, things of that nature, but they were always designed knowing that he was going to be the contractor for the project. So he would come up with these crazy things to do. And I shouldn't say crazy, these really cool design ideas that if you had to pay somebody else to do them, they would cost a fortune. And since he would do it himself with his employees, he could control that cost and he could do the experiments and come up with a way to manufacture or fabricate things that you could meet a cost point because you weren't afraid of it, right? If you one of the examples, he did a house out of some stone, you know, cut stone slabs, and there were all these different sizes of stones that had to be cut to arrange in this kind of crazy pattern. And if you were to call a stonemason and say, how much would you charge for this? They would just throw money at it because they wouldn't have any idea what amount of labor it would take to cut all of these pieces. And he figured out, that you could just use a concrete saw on wheels like they would use to cut joints and slabs. And he set up a pattern. I think there were 3 different patterns that they would cut out of a slab of stone that would give them 12 different pieces of different sizes. And then those 12 pieces would go together in any number of ways to make these patterns. Well, he had a group of students working for him, and he said, okay, you're just going to set up these patterns. So today you're going to cut the A stones for 8 hours. And they would sit there with this concrete saw on wheels and just cut stone for 8 hours. And then, okay, tomorrow you're going to cut the B's. And then the next day you're going to cut the C's. And, in a week's time, you've got enough stone to cover the outside of this house. And so he wound up, what he taught me was, don't let your ideas be held back because somebody else tells you it's going to take too long. Figure out how to do it and either do it yourself or find somebody that understands what you're trying to do that isn't afraid. And he, among other things, I can remember we were he taught me, he didn't teach me I kind of knew how to weld before I got in his class. He taught me how to weld well. So a different level, the beads that Dan would run would look perfect, and it was like, he told me at one point, if you can't make welds that look this good, you're going to have to grind them down so I can't see them. And, it was that. And essentially that was just a push to practice more, right? Practice enough that your welds look good, and then you won't have to worry about grinding them down. And that's solid advice, which I'm still working on that, making my welds look good all the time. But we were making some steel furniture for a project, and one of my buddies, Brennan Graves, who's I still talk to every once in a great while, still a good friend. He was making a table, and it was this really cool crossed up thing with these kind of yokes on the end of some round tubing. And the way that things were fitting together, something wasn't working. He couldn't figure out how to make a cut. And I remember Dan just saying, well, sometimes you got to take a little risk, and, fired up this abrasive chop saw and just grabbed it and took the piece and just like jammed it in the end and the end of it into this saw blade. It makes this terrible noise, but it made the cut exactly like it needed to be made. He's like, sometimes you just got to take a little risk. and that type of thing left an impression on me that sometimes you don't want to take too much risk, right? You don't want to put your body at risk, but a tool is there to do a job. And if you're worried about ruining a $7 saw blade because you didn't stick a part in it perfectly square, it's just a $7 saw blade. You can replace it. And that taught me so much about modifying what you have to suit the purpose that you need it to suit. And it's the same, like people how do I fetishize their tools, right? You have all your wrenches hanging on the wall. They all match. They're the same manufacturer. They slope down just perfectly. You,
Yeah.
you know how it is, right? They all
Uh-huh.
have that shiny chrome on them. And most guys that aren't working doing this stuff full time, you're never going to have to replace a single wrench in your life. Those wrenches are built uh, to a standard that would last 10 generations before one would break and you'd have to replace it. But if you need a wrench that is this thick instead of that thick because it's got to fit down in a skinny spot, what is the first thing you do? You grab that nice shiny wrench out of that set and you put it on the grinding belt and you start taking thickness off of it so that it fits for the purpose you need it. That
Mhm.
is really hard for a lot of people to do because they
Yeah.
don't want to ruin the perfect set that they have. And my question is, well, the set might look perfect, but if it doesn't work the way you need it to work, then what is it? What is the value, right?
Right.
And I can remember I've got it's a punch flange tool. So if you're working in sheet metal and you have two pieces that you don't want to butt weld, you want to do a lap joint, right? This punch flange tool, one end of it will flange a piece so that it has a little kind of Z section on it. And the other one will punch holes. The other end of it will punch holes so that you can plug weld into that flange, right? And I was doing something on my Carmen Gia restoration years and years ago, but I needed this punch flange tool to punch a bunch of holes in something. And I was in this weird position where the handle to operate the tool was too long. I couldn't get it in there without firing and whatever else. And I remember grabbing the tool and taking a whizzer wheel and just cutting off the handle to it, right? The whatever the actuator handle. And Andrea's uncle was standing there. He's like, "Don't do that!" Like he just had this freak out, and I'm like, "This tool is not working for what I need it. I have to put a hole right there, and the only way for me to put that hole there is to cut the handle off this tool." And that tool is still in my toolbox. I still use it all the time, and it works just fine with a short handle. And I'll probably go to my grave and that will be the only punch flange tool in my box. But Dan Rockhill taught me that sometimes, you just have to do what you have to do, and tools are replaceable. If you need another new bright shiny wrench because you ground one down, you can go to Home Depot and buy a replacement wrench. It may have a slightly different branding on it than they
You
had
just buy a
20
whole
years
new
ago.
set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that was there were so many little lessons like that. I sat through 30 lectures from Dan over the course of 2 years, and then I had a couple classes with him outside of those lecture classes. But the little nuggets that I picked up from Dan Rockhill about how he worked and what he was able to accept as a roadblock and what he was unwilling to accept as a roadblock. And I would tell you 99% of the roadblocks he was unwilling to accept. And his answer was, I'll build a way around the roadblock. And he did not let those roadblocks dumb down his design. He'd rather he'd rather not do the project than compromise on the design. And that, I guarantee that is his philosophy. And that taught me a lot, and how at what length will you go to realize the vision that you have in your head, and what is the hill that's worth dying on and what is the hill that's not worth dying on, because there is a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I
But
have a lot of hills like that worth dying that I don't want to die on, but as I approach the closer to end of life, some of those things become less important
Yeah.
over time. Like, yeah, I'm gonna let that one go.
Yeah.
I
And
got other things to do.
there are definitely hills to die on. Like,
Yeah.
and I shouldn't say die on, but you spend a lot of time on them. Like
Hmm.
I'm going to go down if if this doesn't work out. And most of the time, if you pick on something long enough, it'll work out. And most of the time, once it does work out and you know the answer and you know how to get there, you can refine that process and you realize that, wait a minute, I can get to this result many different ways. And this way over here might be much faster than what I did initially. But I am I am of the ilk that, it goes back to one of my good friends, architect buddies. He retired from the profession and is now a professor at a university. Very wise man, and he and I kind of came up together in the profession, as it were. And he said, you can always tell in a class of students who has the adjustable triangle, because their buildings don't have 45-degree and 30-degree angles everywhere. He said they have whatever angle they want. And, you kind of sit back and you think about that. And in design school, there were a number of us that were limited because we had those 30-degree and 60-degree triangles, and we didn't draw a 57-degree line because we didn't have that tool.
Yeah.
And when that light bulb comes on and you realize, wait a minute, I can take my 30-degree triangle and just tilt it and it can be any angle I want, you start realizing that you need to acknowledge what's limiting you, and then you need to find a way around that. And once you do, then it really starts to open the door for, maybe I want a trapezoidal shaped window. Can I do that? Well, I can't buy one at Home Depot, but can I do that? Yes, you can.
Yeah.
Bruce Goff, look at any of Bruce Goff's houses. They don't have square and rectangular windows. And he figured out a way to do it back in the 70s and 80s. Uh, so anyway, but yeah, Dan was a huge influence on me, both on the design side of things, but then also on the, if you design it and nobody can build it for you, then you need to figure out how to build it yourself. And that it's two things. It's incredibly empowering, and it's like a it's like a prison sentence sometimes, because you can't get past that. Once you know that you can build things and do things exactly the way you want them, you can't accept the fact that somebody else can't.
Yeah.
And as a professional designing buildings for other people that you can't swing the hammer on, it is incredibly frustrating. And I'll tell the one story, another sidebar here. We had a school that we were designing, and one of the designers I was working with wanted a ceiling that kind of undulated. And so, in elementary school, that's a really cool thing. Well, then there was this huge round drum, like maybe 12 feet in diameter, that came through the center of this undulating ceiling. And the first reaction from the contractor was, "Oh God, no! There's nobody who can cut this metal ceiling, curved this way." And so that piece of the design almost didn't make it into the final thing. And I can remember saying, "Stop! You're saying that, but you haven't talked to any tradesmen. There's not a single person that you talk to confirm that your fear of intersecting curves is based in reality." Well, yeah, you need this gap around it. And there's no way to measure that gap because you can't, the angles. It would take a computer science degree to calculate this thing out. I said, well, let's see, let's talk to some craftsmen and see. And we talked to somebody who was familiar with that ceiling system. They said, well, we don't know how we're going to do it, but we think we can get there. We think we can lay that out. Okay, great. And I remember going out to the site when the guy was installing that ceiling. He was just some ceiling installer guy. I guess you would call him a carpenter. And I remember talking to him. I'm like, hey, are you having trouble, getting this thing to intersect with this drum? He's like, not really. I'm like, okay. And he goes, I'm working with pieces of metal that are only 6 inches wide. So I can just kind of hold it up here and scribe the edge of this drum. And then I just take off an inch for the gap. And that's the thing. And it came
Hmm.
out, it looks perfect. Like it looks like it was CNC cut around this thing. And the guy just had a pair of tin snips and a pencil.
Nice. Nice.
And you know, that is the thing. Like, don't give up on the idea because somebody said they can't do it. Like,
Yeah.
so
So I want to
anyway,
go back to your when you're talking about drawing, you could tell which guy had the angle finder and triangle. I was watching a talk. I think Dammy Lee. She's a YouTube architecture person personality, and she was talking about a study that was done that they looked at analyzed all kinds of architectural students drawings, and they categorized them like this person draws really boxy type stuff and these have more fluid and curves, Frank Gehry style. And then they went and looked at the software, and all the boxy people were using Revit because Revit's really great at drawing boxes. And
yeah,
all the curvy people were using Rhino because Rhino's really great at drawing sculptural curvy
yeah.
stuff. So yeah, you're influenced not only by the people you meet, but by the tools you have to use.
So that was, my goodness, rewind the clock. Not quite 20 years ago, but it it was more than 15. Um, the office I was working at was thinking about adopting Revit as a platform to draw with. And I was in charge of evaluating the software. And that was one of my big things. I don't want the software to hinder the design, right? Like, so at the end of the day, as an architect, if your software can't draw it, you can still draw the detail by hand and stamp it, and it becomes part of your drawing set, even if the computer can't do it. So there's
Hmm.
no excuse for software limiting what you can do because you can still do it by hand. And you look at some of the greatest buildings, the TWA building at LAX that Saarinen did, that was all drawn by hand. And so you can't tell me that we're incapable of drawing these things by hand and getting them built, because we can. So I was always of the ilk that if you can't get the software to draw it in Photoshop, draw it in Illustrator, draw it somewhere, draw it flat, and just make it work. You're an architect, you have the training to do it. And so when I was evaluating Revit, the first, and we were evaluating several pieces of software at the time because there were other competitors out there. And so my make or break thing was, I want to draw a serpentine wall with, in elevation, a serpentine top to the wall. And if my software can't do that, then it's not the right software. And Revit could never perform that task. Now, it can at this point in time, and it sort of could back then, but nobody knew how to do it. I now know that there's a what do they call it? A, a solid modeling component or something like that to Revit that's sort of outside the normal tools, and
Hmm.
it simplifies it into, sort of like extrude, subtract, and whatever slice tools. And so you could make the solid form out of that, and then you take that back into sort of the inner workings of Revit, and you say, okay, now slice this solid model apart and make this a wall, make that a roof, make this a whatever. And so you could actually do that. But yeah, when the sales guy couldn't make that happen, I would just go, okay, I think we're done talking.
Yeah.
And again, it was Revit. I think ArchiCAD might have been one of the ones we were looking at, and then MicroStation was out there, and Rhino was in its infancy, and nobody was using Rhino for architectural documentation. People were using it for modeling experiments, but not for documentation back then. But I did wind up, I had a copy. I always like to brag. I had a copy of Rhino 1, and oh gosh, I'm losing the guy's name. Um, the guy who developed Rhino, I called him on the phone, and he was the one who helped me get the licensing set up for it. So Anyway, that was back in the days, early,
Yeah.
early, early days of Rhino.
Yeah. So,
So go ahead.
yeah, so kind of back on our topic, I really only have one more just to kind of briefly touch on, and it's not a person, it's another group of people kind of
Uh-huh.
playing off of James's idea of always be learning from new people, and that is my clients.
Oh
I have
yeah.
had clients that have pushed me, just like your story about the curved ceiling. Like, how are you going to do that? I have clients that have pushed me to do things and figure out things that I've never done before, and that has really leapfrogged my skill as a craftsman. Stuff that I would have never even attempted without someone saying, "Hey, I want you to build this for me," and me going, "Well, I don't know how to do that. I guess I got to figure it out." Especially in some months when it's slow, you can't afford to turn down work, so
Yeah.
you're just like, "I don't want to do this, but I'm going to figure out how to do this because I need to eat." And yeah, so clients have exponentially probably one of the biggest influences on my skill being jumped huge steps just because it's pushed me way out of my comfort zone to make things happen.
Yeah. That is well, I think a lot of us that do things like this have a pretty strong internal drive. Like otherwise we wouldn't be doing these things, right?
Right.
We'd be working at a job where people tell you what to do.
Yeah.
um and and but yeah, it's always good to have an external group pushing you beyond what you think you're capable of. And I've always said, the people who um know what you're capable of believe in you more than you believe in yourself. And that, that's a hard thing to put into words, at least for me, but it's true. Like I believe in other people way more than they believe in themselves, and it's like I know you can do this. Like why couldn't you do this? You can do all this other stuff. You can absolutely do this stuff.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's good to have that external push because we may not have that comfort level, but that goes back to the old saying that the more uncomfortable you are, the more you're learning,
Yeah.
the more you're growing. Like that feeling of discomfort means you're growing.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just also not just skill wise, but like creativity wise. Like a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times, a project might not go, but I spend a lot of time developing the idea, and then it's like, okay, I'm going to put that one in my back pocket, even though the client didn't buy that idea, and then it'll get built someday, or I'll pitch it to a new client someday, or it'll spark some kind of new thought process or new trajectory to explore. And uh and I think that's true for a lot of people. Like several years ago, I really wanted to like be able to explore my own art, so I was really pushing the YouTube thing to try to get sponsors so I could do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that way I could just make money making YouTube, making whatever I wanted. And I could never really get there. And I think it's probably better that I didn't get there, because a lot of the guys that I used to watch that did get there, that no longer do client work now, are just like, oh, here's this tool that I got for free, or I'm being paid to sponsor. And so now they're not doing the creative work anymore. They're doing the cubicle job type of job. They're sitting in their shop with their camera, bowing down to the client, corporate client, instead of the creative client, where the
Yeah.
creative client wanted you to build this thing. And so I kind of look at it as a blessing that I never made my YouTube channel into a major source of income. That it's just kind of like this trickle of things, more
Yeah.
of a hobby now than anything.
Uh, that was one thing I learned early on is that YouTube is a part of a bigger business plan, right? And
Right.
YouTube is really a much better promotional engine than it is a revenue generating engine.
Right. And if you
And
make it a revenue generation engine, then you are the slave to the algorithm and to
yeah,
your sponsor instead of your creative outlet.
yeah, YouTube becomes your employer rather than your advertising
Right. And
vehicle.
you're no longer running your own business anymore.
Yeah.
You're
And
a franchise
yeah.
kind of a thing.
And we've discussed it before. Like I hear so many people, oh, I had to get something out this week for my video. No, you didn't. You absolutely didn't. Like
Yeah.
if that's what you're doing, you're shortchanging yourself and you're shortchanging your audience. Take
Hmm.
another week and make it better. You
Right.
know,
Make the thing you want to make, not the thing that you need to make.
yeah, yeah. And usually when you hear that at the front end of a video, it means what you're about to see is garbage. Sorry
Yeah.
if I'm picking on anybody out there who's done
Uh,
that, but
I mean,
uh,
I've done that trying to make it happen. So it's just the truth of the thing. It's not picking on any one person. It's
yeah,
just that's how the industry is.
yeah, it
Yeah.
is. But well, I'm looking at the clock. We've been on here well over an hour.
All right. Do you have any last person you want to throw out there?
Um, I had one other person on my list, and it's a group of people, but there's probably one person at the head of it, and it's my wife's family. So I mentioned Grandpa Cecil, um, but he definitely had a lot of influence on me and helped shape a lot of my skills. And introduced me to the machining world and some other things that I had no introduction to prior to that. But uh, her uncle, she has a handful of uncles, and they're all in the construction industry, and they all do different things. And one of her uncles, in specific, Kevin, who passed away a little over a decade ago, I think. Um, when I was building my garage at my very first house, so this was the very first thing that was mine. I had a piece of property, and I was going to build a thing on the piece of property, and we were getting ready to pour footings for this garage. And there was an existing foundation. It was a single car garage, and I was making it into a 2-car garage so I could have a shop to restore my Karmann Ghia in. And I rented a Bobcat and I rented a Digit, and we wound up hauling off a bunch of dirt and everything else. My buddy had a dump truck, and we took like 20 some odd loads of dirt out of there because it was built into a hillside. And I went and we dug the footings, and I didn't know what I was doing with concrete work at all, really, other than I knew I needed some concrete. And I dug these footings, and they weren't level. And I went and picked up the first yard and a half, I think, or maybe it's just a yard, in a yard hauler. Went and picked it up, and Kevin just happened to be driving by that day, and he came in and he's like, "What are you doing?" I go, "Well, I'm getting ready to pour this footing. I got to get rid of this concrete and then go pick up another 2 yards. So I got 2 more trips to make." And he just looked and he goes, do you have a level?" And I said, "Yeah, I have a level. It's right here." He goes, these footings aren't level. What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm just going to cut the concrete forms, so that the footings might not be level." And I don't know how far they were out, maybe 6 inches front to back, over, 6 inches over 24 feet or something like that. It's not terribly out of level, but enough that I would have had to modify forms. Because, "No, you want these level." And I said, "Yeah, but I don't have this backhoe anymore. And the concrete's sitting right here starting to get hard." And he's like, "You're going to have to take that concrete back to where it came from and dump it out because you're not pouring these footings today." And I can remember just being so pissed off that this guy is on my property telling me that I can't pour the concrete that I just bought. And like, he was physically going to stop me. Like, he was that adamant that we weren't pouring that concrete. I go, "Well, then we need to get digging right now." And there was 4 of us there. He goes, "Everybody grab a shovel." He goes, "But I'm telling you right now, you need to take that concrete back because we're not going to get to it. It's going to get hard before we get to it." I said, "Okay." He goes, "But it's more important. And it was, middle of July, hotter than Hades out. So we all start digging, and we start getting it level, and I'm like, "Holy crap, we're really having to dig quite a ways down." I was a lot further off than I thought I was, some
Yeah.
young punk. And we wind up, getting the back line level to where it needed to be. And he's like, "All right, where's that concrete at?" And you kind of dig it. It's like, it's starting to get a little chunky. He goes, "Throw it in the hole. We're going to see if we can get it to lay flat." And, thankfully, it, like I said, it was starting to get hard, but it was just soft enough that we were able to place it and get it, solidified and all those kind of things. And we wound up pouring the footings that day, but it wasn't, it was 2 hours or 3 hours later than I thought I was going to. And, once we got that back line done, he said, "All right, you go get the next thing of concrete. We're going to sit here and dig the rest of this footing out. We're going to have it level by the time you get back." And wound up doing the whole thing. And when we started putting up the concrete forms, which I built the concrete forms just out of plywood and John A. Cowbells and dingers, I think are what they call it, whalers and all that kind of stuff. I built my own concrete forms. When we did it, the concrete forms set perfectly level, were exactly what they needed to be. And I was like, you know what? If Kevin had not stopped here and stopped me from making that mistake, this job would have been horrible. It would have been so much more difficult. So I look at that lesson that he taught me, but her whole family helped me build that garage. And, you know, she had an uncle that was really good at carpentry. She had another uncle that was an operator and he helped me do the dirt work. And, you know, the other uncle who was pouring concrete and, you know, just on and on. And I learned so much from my wife's family. It's not even funny. And, you know, we built Cecil's house and we did work down at their lake house. And, you know, from a home construction perspective, I learned so much from all of those people, and they've been such a huge influence on me over my life. And we still, when we get together, I was with them last weekend. We sit and talk about construction projects and what are you doing and how much pipe are you laying this week and all those kind of things. So it's been interesting to see that over the course of, you know, I met my wife when I was in high school. So they started as an influence on me in high school, and then they've continued all the way through till present day for sure.
All right. So before we close out, I have one question for you. And I hate the term like what kind of legacy you want to leave behind because that sounds very
Oh yeah.
pompous to me. But like, are there things that you're hoping to influence, or people you're trying hope to influence before you leave this world?
Yeah. Well, I'll go back to, you know, when somebody in the neighborhood that I was growing up in opened his shop to me and my friends and showed me what he was doing. I understand at this point in my life how important that was for me. And the I don't have any kids. So I don't have kid responsibilities. And I've realized that maybe my role in life wasn't to have kids and teach my kids, but my role in life might be to teach other kids. And I've always had, if somebody shows any interest in all, whether they want to learn to weld or machine or do some form of woodworking or work on cars or engines or whatever it is, I open my door and whatever you want to learn, let's just do something. Let's figure out a something for me to show you. And one example, my dad has a neighbor back in Kansas City, and he's a young man. I think he's a senior in high school, and it's like a sophomore or a freshman in high school. Uh, his mom said he wants to get into blacksmithing and he wants to machine things and do stuff. And so I went and visited with him, and she wound up, she goes, what can I buy him? I said, if he wants a lathe or a mill or something like that, you can find them fairly inexpensive used. I said, he's a high school student. He doesn't need to be doing high precision parts. He just needs to be making stuff. So she bought him kind of a used lathe and a fairly inexpensive mill, and he started making cool parts, combining it with what he was blacksmithing and all this other stuff. And they came out. He was a Boy Scout, and they came out to camp in Colorado and to do something. And my dad said, "Hey, they're coming through town," and I said, "Just have them stop by the shop." And he stopped by, and I can't remember what I had set up in my Tormach, but I said, if you want to, let's make a part while you're here. I've got the Tormach programmed up. I've got Fusion. I'll show you the computer file. We can talk about it, and then we can just machine a part, and I can show you all the things that go into machining a part. And so we sat here for 2 or 3 hours while his mom went and got lunch. I don't know what she did. She did something, but she just dropped him off, and we made a part. And when we were done, I could see the wheels turning in his head, and I knew that 2 or 3 hours that I spent with him was going to change his trajectory in life, hopefully for the better. But, you know, even if it's, you know, if he becomes an industrial designer or if he decides to become a machinist or whatever it is, I think he's got, you know, higher, better uses of his time than just doing production stuff. But I think he's going to be one of those guys that comes out and is going to do something in an industry to change it. Like, so that's my legacy, is leaving people like that behind. And that's why I do YouTube videos, both on the guitar side and not the guitar side. It's like, if you can just do a simple video and open somebody's eyes to the fact that if your refrigerator is broken, you don't have to call the refrigerator repair guy. You can tear into it and figure out what's wrong and fix it. Like
Yeah.
you can do all these things. And, you know, so yeah, that's what I want my legacy to be for certain, is just having the same stories that we have about the people who influenced us. I hope that some of the people that I've shared with over the years will have certain things. And same goes for my coworkers. If they want to make anything, my shop is an open door. They can come over and make anything they want, and I'll help them do it. How about you, Brian?
So yeah, so I one of the furniture makers that I've always really admired was Sam Maloof.
Oh
And
yeah.
Sam Maloof, as he got older, it got to the point to where he couldn't just go out there and put in a 10-hour day in, right? And so he had apprentices that became master carpenters underneath him. And when he passed away, they are still building the Maloof style chairs, and they have made basically from Sam's help, they have created jobs for themselves and they are continuing on. And so I kind of like think about that. Like someday I'm hoping to be able to bring on some apprentices to teach how I do things and how I build things and create jobs for them and their families. And that after I go on, they can continue on as well.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that entrepreneurial spirit is another thing that I try and pass on to people.
Yeah.
Like if you're doing something, if you're making something that's important, there's a good chance that it's going to be important to someone else. And that's a business model, whether that's a business model to tinker with in your garage, or whether that's a business model to not have to work for somebody else. There's a pretty good chance that it can improve your life because you have this weird idea that other people may benefit from.
Yeah.
Um,
Not everybody's cut out to work in a cubicle or for a large corporation and be bound by such a set of rules like that. To me, that was like a soul crushing part of my life when I worked in those places. And then when I started my own business, it was just like this freeing thing. I had more time with my kids and family and more time to explore and do the things that I like to do.
Yeah. And I've somehow worked in the corporate world most of my career, or pretty much all my career. And not all of it, but most of my career. But I've carved this weird niche for myself over the years where
Yeah.
I get to have this incredibly different day-to-day life. Like I don't do the same thing twice ever. And I've managed to sort of sidestep that corporate life while still having my toes in it, which I I consider myself very lucky to have done that, but it's also been through a lot of hard work that I've put myself in position to do that too,
Mhm.
right? Like people have to trust that you're going to do the right thing if they give you that longer leash. And now I'm at a point where I'm an owner, so it's a little different set of circumstances, but nonetheless, I don't like to do the same thing 2 days in a row. That really
Yeah.
starts to get to me. So, well, cool. I think we'll wrap it up there if that's all
Yeah.
right, Brian.
Let's do it.
It's been great chatting about people who influenced our lives. So, on that note, I am Greg Porter. You can find me at Skyscraper Guitars and Greg's Garage, both on Instagram and YouTube.
And I'm Brian Benham. You can find me at Benham_design on pretty much every platform out there. You're listening to the Maker's Quest podcast. If you want to check out any of our past shows, check out themakersquest.com. Thanks for listening.